And now I'd like to officially welcome you to our overview at the AIA Virginia's 2021 Design Awards program. I'm Rhea George, the Managing Director with AIA Virginia, and I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge and thank today's panelists. Chris Warren, AIA, serves on the AIA Virginia Board of Directors, and he is an active contributor to our Outreach Advisory Council. That's the body that oversees our awards program. He's going to give us an overview of the enhancements to this year's Design Awards. Michelle Ampt, AIA, is a national and state leader of the Committee on the Environment, or COTE. She'll give us a high-level overview of the framework for design excellence. We've set aside a few minutes at the end of the presentation to answer any of your questions, so please add them to the Q&A tool. And now I'll turn things over to Chris. Chris?
Hey, good afternoon, everybody, and happy Friday. My name is Chris Warren, and I am the president-elect of Hampton Roads and a member of the State Board Outreach Advisory Council. So we're going to start with some basic objectives today about what we're going to talk about. Get my computer right. So the first thing, as you can see, we're going to explain how the awards program is evaluated and refined. Then we're going to describe the driving factors behind the recent changes to the program, discuss the integration of the AIA's framework for design excellence. That's a big point this year, and then describe the new awards categories. So when we were thinking about the considerations for the changes, we had many conversations between our state Outreach Advisory Council, the Honors and Diversity Task Force, the JEDI Council, previous jurors, et cetera, et cetera. Lots of people gave their input to help us come up with these changes. So some of the first considerations that we had is we wanted to reduce the barriers to entry. You know, the difficulty that it takes might take a firm to enter the design awards, the time that it takes to put everything together, and along with the time, the resources that it could take. You know, we wanted to make sure that our design awards were very accessible. You know, a lot of times smaller firms can feel left out, and we wanted to make sure that everybody, including the small firms, including the solo people, they can feel included. Whether, you know, that included the entry, the photography, the price, all of that. We want everyone to be involved. Diversity, you know, diversity of firms, diversity of people, and diversity of projects, all very important, and we're trying to increase the diversity of everything within our design awards. And a phased approach. As if you've been following our entering project for a few years, you probably noticed that there's been some changes every year, and this is kind of, you know, changing a little bit as well to include more of the framework for design excellence. So who and what informed the latest decision? I touched on that a little bit, but obviously feedback from members, council and committee members, subject matter experts like you're about to hear from, feedback and jury members and national staff, you know, environmental scan, and of course, the strategic initiatives like the framework for design excellence, climate action plan, and strategic plan. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Michelle.
Hey, everyone. So the framework for design excellence was constructed by the National Committee on the Environment about 2017, and the COTE Top 10 Awards piloted it for a couple of years. With a big move in AI National and its direction toward focus on climate action, it was adopted as the framework that the national awards all follow. So now the Design Excellence Award nationally, things like the Committee on the Environment Award, all require submissions around using the framework and submitting under each of the principles. It's also been trickling down to state level awards, and it's great to see AIA getting on board with that. So I'll go through and explain what exactly it is. Next slide. So there are 10 measures. Each one starts with this design for piece. So the first one is design for integration, and it's really the big idea. So how sustainability, equity, resilience informs the sort of organization of the project. It's your elevator pitch, basically. How do you bring everything together around this one or two ideas? I think if you look at that section, what makes the project one that people will fight to preserve, knowing that beloved buildings are the ones that continue, it's kind of the emphasis of this principle. Next one. Equitable communities has taken on particularly important significance the past year, of course, and it has to do with how the project benefits the greater community. So both in terms of transit, in terms of connectivity, in terms of continued park space, that kind of thing. So, and how the community is engaged in the creation of the project. Next one. Design for ecosystems has to do with how the project benefits the ecosystem in which it exists. So both human and non-human. So how does it contribute to the watershed? How does it expand habitat? How does it reduce maintenance and restore ecosystem health? That kind of thing. Next one. Design for water looks at water quality and potable water use. So, how do you step water use? What do you do with stormwater? How do you contribute to the watershed? Next one. Design for economy is how do you make the most of the budget and resources that you have? So right sizing systems, decisions that were made that have triple bottom line benefits, that type of thing. How you extend the life of a project or reduce operational costs for clients. Next one. Design for energy has to do with alignment with the 2030 commitment. How do you use passive design strategies to reduce energy use, the active systems that you use to move close to net zero. Next one. Design for well-being has everything to do with occupant health. So occupant and human health. So how do you encourage healthy living? What do you do for indoor air quality? How do you reduce hazards? Inclusivity in terms of design. Next one. Design for resources is all about the supply chain of your project. So where do the materials come from? How do you reduce embodied energy? How do you support renewable resources and local materials, that kind of thing. Next one. Design for change is how you design the building to evolve over time and how you design in resiliency, both site resiliency, but also how quickly can the building bounce back from, say, a hurricane or from a power flux or something like that. Next one. Design for discoveries. How much do you share of what you have learned from the project, and how much have you gone back to the building once it's open and figured out what's working and what's not and shared those lessons learned? Next one. So that was really quick, but don't worry, you don't have to worry about keeping all the stuff in your head. There's this thing called the toolkit. So that link you see at the bottom is where all of this stuff is written up. So next slide. When you go and you click on each measure, you'll get a screen that looks like this, and you can see the bars down at the bottom. Next one. The bars are these things. So best practices, high impact things you can do, resources that show you how to do these things, and case studies for projects. Often they're top 10 winners. So you can see what the kind of description of each one of these measures are, metrics that are used around it, and then where you can learn more about it. So you can see the kinds of things that are considered in each one of these categories. And they're always kind of evolving, but it'll give you a sense of how to incorporate those concepts into how you describe your project. And eventually that it'll start informing how your projects evolve. Next slide. There you go. There's the link again. And I think that's back over to Chris.
Cool. Thank you, Michelle. I hope everybody paid good attention to that, because it's going to be very important for this year and the years going forward. as she put this, the hyperlink on the slide, the AIA Nationals website has really good descriptions of all of the categories for the framework. So of course, what we're all here today is to talk about the changes in the entry process. So to start, part of the entry process will be to add unpaid labor declaration to the entry form. And you will see that on there on the next slide. Obviously, we're going to have a major overlay of the framework for design excellence into all aspects of the projects. And then we have some new and revised award categories for small project awards and extended use awards. So this is going to be the new project information sheet that everyone will be filling out and submitting. To start, on the right side, we have some basic project information, trying to just kind of, figure out the numbers. If you have any kind of data that you've collected on your building, that can kind of inform how well it performs. On the left, we have a space for the measures. You'll see that there is a block for each one, each measure that we just talked about, and the blue text is the hyperlink to that measure on the AIA Nationals website for a further description. So in the block that you're going to write 1,500 characters about how your project fits the description of that measure. And it should be, if once you read it and kind of figure out what that is, I think it'll be pretty self-explanatory. But, we're trying to have or award excellent buildings, and we have a framework for that. And it's important for us and the jurors to understand how your buildings integrate this framework into it as you were designing it. So next slide. So some of the changes that we have for the small project awards are now going to be given in 3 categories, offering opportunities for recognition to a wide range of projects and budgets. So this is part of the accessibility that we were talking about, trying to allow some other things for smaller firms or smaller projects. So category 1, small project construction, object, work, or environmental, art, or architectural design element up to $150,000 in construction costs. Category 2, small project construction up to $500,000 in construction cost. And category 3, small project construction, object, work of environmental art or architectural design under 2,500 square feet. And the architect must have had a significant role in the construction, fabrication, and or installation of work in addition to being the designer. And then all projects must demonstrate design achievement, including how the project fits into the environment and how the project connects to the framework for design excellence. So the existing built environment represents significant investments in energy, resources, and embodied carbon. Consequently, renovating existing structures dramatically reduces the embodied carbon released compared to new construction. These projects also represent a substantial part of the contemporary practice. So these awards recognizes design work with existing buildings to help achieve carbon reduction with the creative reuse and adaptation of existing structures. So these are given in 3 categories. So historic preservation, adaptive or continued use, and continued use of owner-occupied single-family house following a renovation. So there are a few unchanged categories, which I'm sure that many of you are already familiar with. So standard architecture category, contextual design, interiors, and residential design. So now we're going to open it up to questions.
So Chris, this is Ria, and I just anticipating a question from some members of our audience about the 10 measures. So one thing I just would like to point out is that we recognize that all 10 measures may not apply to every project. And so it's perfectly reasonable for you to write NA in that particular measures field, or explain why it didn't align with your project. The jury is going to consider the projects holistically. And so this project information form with the 10 measures will really help inform their conversation. So I just want to make sure folks understand that you don't need to fill in every single one of those fields if it doesn't apply to your project. One other thing is if for some reason your client prefers to keep some of that information confidential, maybe they don't want to share the square footage, or they aren't comfortable sharing the energy usage, that's okay. Just there's a space right there on the form to make note of that. And so I do see some questions coming in from the Q&A. I'm going to go ahead and stop the share so that we can share faces. I'll go ahead and turn my camera on too. So several chapters just focus on 3 of the 10 measures. And so to be clear, the AIA Virginia Awards, you'll want all 10 addressed.
Well,
so, yeah.
I was going to say, as Rhea just said, if any of the measures are applicable to your project, please give us an explanation. But not for every project, they're not going to apply. So feel free just to put NA. It does kind of give the jurors a little more insight, and can help distinguish, who the award should go to. But they are not necessary for every measure, for every project.
Yeah, and I might add to that, and Michelle, you may as well, having served on the national COAT jury, don't feel like you have to fill up the space on those forms. The jurors are wading through a lot of information. So if there's something that's not relevant, it's okay to leave that out.
And I think we should also add that this is going to be like kind of the cover sheet, the page 1. A lot of times, the project narrative will be on the rest of the 6 sheets that you submit. So I think while previously this kind of cover sheet had the project narrative that everybody wrote out, this is going to focus on the framework, and then the project narrative can go on the other sheets.
Yeah, that's a great observation, Chris. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Michelle.
Oh, I was just going to say that the way that National is looking at it is, if you take all these measures together, it's kind of that 100% good of what like design quality looks like. And so it goes deeper than the, the look competition that, and tries to make it dig a little bit deeper into like the whole story of the project. So this is a great chance for you all to really tell the kind of deeper, longer history of the project and what was important to the client, and really get into how you took these ideas and realize them into form. So I think of it as an asset for greater storytelling, and not kind of more blanks that you have to fill.
That's a great point, Michelle, and it kind of leads into one of our next questions was, is there a change in how the images and graphics need to be handled for the rest of the entry? And that answer really is no. So we wanted to leave room for the submitter to tell the story of their project in the way they felt best communicated about the project. So feel free to include as many images. I mean, the limit is 7 pages, with that first one being the project information form, but the remaining 6 pages can be, if you've submitted previously, very similar to the way that you've done it in the past. Of course, again, the story and images are should be compelling. And we'd encourage you to get creative and really think about that narrative. So the next question that we've got is, can you provide any insight on how these awards and updates coordinate with other Virginia chapters if entrants are thinking about submitting across programs? So I think many of the chapters are looking at how to integrate the framework into their entry process. Some, as I think someone asked previously, are asking folks to include at least 3 measures in their narrative. Others don't require any of them, just encourage you to address them in your standard submission narrative. Then, of course, if you're thinking of submitting at the national level, you'll be asked to address these measures of the framework. Chris, I don't know if you got some insights to share from your local.
Yeah, I was just going to say we had our board meeting this week, and we're just starting to come up with the planning. You know, starting to look at it again, starting to look at the categories, and I can guarantee you that these measures are going to be a part of our submissions to some degree. So probably something very similar to this.
Great, thanks. So the next question is the dollar limit for small project. The dollar limit for small projects seems very limiting. I would suggest that the 500,000 seems way too low for small. Is it really fair for a 2 million project to compete with a 50 million project? So that's a great answer, and we noodled around with these numbers a bit as well. And I think where we landed for this year was that we wanted to create space where these are truly small projects, and we felt like if the numbers ended up being too low, then we're going to take a look at that and evaluate. So one of the things that our Outreach Advisory Council does every year is looks at this process, evaluates the awards. So with these being new, there may be room for change. So we may not have hit on the sweet spot. Anything else you'd add, Chris?
Just, you know, that every year, yeah, it's a process. We're tweaking a little bit, and we'd actually debated about the 500,000 number, and that thought that was a reasonable number for a small project. Now, you know, they are correct in that going to the 2 million range, I feel like that kind of puts it at maybe like a medium project. But we were trying to focus, you know, this is the small project award category, and our kind of standard for a small project, you know, we thought was fair at 500,000.
Yeah, so again, that may change in future years, and keep suggestions and feedback coming. This is a whole new.
Please give us feedback.
Yeah, this is a whole new category for us. We haven't previously had a small projects category. We did have small projects that were entered in any of the other, at the time, 5 categories. But this was something that we wanted to make sure created some accessibility. One thing I'd note too on the extended use category. So some of you remember the historic preservation category. It used to be just its own category, and it is now just sort of popped under the umbrella of extended use because it's a specific type of building reuse. And Chris, I think you were going to add something there
with the store. Oh, I was going to talk about the small project thing again.
Okay, got it.
You know, we're, you know, comparing if a $200 or $2 million project is kind of, you know, fair to compete against a 50 million, but you know, when it comes to small projects, you know, you got to think maybe a less than $500,000 project isn't quite fair to compete against a $2 to $5 million kind of medium-sized project too. So if those are categories that we kind of need to evolve over time, we could certainly do that.
Great, thank you. So we do have a couple other questions. The one of them is very easy. I'm going to go ahead right now and paste the link to the toolkit into the chat. So if you haven't opened that up, you can pull that out. You can also download the chat by hovering over in the little space where you would type a chat. There's 3 little dots. If you click on that, it'll allow you to download the chat if you didn't access the link.
I also
And then
dropped into the chat the link to the top 10 awards from this year. And I encourage anyone who's struggling with like how to fill out the little boxes about each measure to take a look at those, because they publish everything that was submitted on this project. So the images and the narratives and the data, so you can get a sense of like what kinds of things fall into those categories and how to talk about them. Those are kind of the top of the entries this year. In particular, also looking at, say, the Rockwell submission, Lafayette College, that entry is particularly good at connecting the visuals to the narrative. So if you think about all these things talking to one another, that one's a really good one to look at. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Oh, that's a great tip, Michelle. Thank you.
And then, yeah, one more point on the extended use awards. You know, we wanted to focus on that a little bit more this year, you know, as we have these 3 new categories. You know, especially with historic preservation, you know, history is very important to Virginia. It's, you know, part of our history and culture, of course, and architectural buildings being a big part of that. And we wanted to really try to highlight that this year. You know, we see it being important to our state. And so.
Great. Yeah, and I guess the other thing I'd add to that is, so that adaptive or continued use category would encompass things like additions or substantial renovations, which were always eligible to submit in any of our previous categories. But what we were seeing is they weren't being submitted, and so they weren't being recognized. And work on existing buildings it makes up a substantial percentage of the work that firms across the country do, and there really didn't seem to be space for that in our awards program. And so that's this is our attempt to really address that. And then I'd say the owner occupied single family home after renovation was really an effort to elevate the awareness of a tax credit that's available through the state to encourage more owners to take advantage of it. So we do have another question. Are the new small projects categories open to temporary installations or projects that fall under a traveling installation exhibition scenario? How are you defining built? So that's a great question. And one we didn't discuss. So we may need to circle back on that front. My gut is if it's built, it's built. Of course, the application to the framework would still apply. And so thinking about those questions about materials and sustainability and those kinds of things would still overlay it. But I may need to reconvene with our group to just see how we want to define built, whether temporary installations would be appropriate. It's a great question.
We
Chris,
actually had this same issue on COAT this year, that we had a temporary exhibit that applied, and the jury felt like while it didn't win, it was considered a built project, and the measures for that one particularly focused on resources, reuse, and light. So
great. Well, that's helpful to have that perspective from the national level. And so someone else asked, will the slides be available for download? Yes, I will post this slide deck to our call for entries post right there on the AIA Virginia website. I'm also happy to email it out to all of our attendees today. We'll also post this recording on that same page. So if you ever need to go back and say, hey, what do they say about this? We'll have that there as well, probably in a couple of days. So I want to give a moment for any other questions. We've wrapped up all of the ones that have been submitted through the Q&A tool. But I do want to take a minute to thank both Chris and Michelle. So Chris is pinch hitting. He was only supposed to present the beginning portion, but our other presenter had to back out, unfortunately, and so he stepped up to fill in that last section. So thank you, Chris. And then, of course, thank you so much, Michelle, for all the insights you've given us throughout the process as we evaluated the program, and then for coming today and sharing all of the elements of the framework. So with that, I think we'll be able to wrap up. I hope everyone has a fantastic weekend, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time. And of course, if you ever have any other questions about the Design Awards, you can certainly email me. My information is on the website. Thanks so much, and I hope everyone has a great day.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Later, y'all.